It's always nice to unbox a fresh new Leica lens. And I just got in this brand new Leica 28mm Elmarit f2.8. But why did I buy this lens when I already have two 28mm M lenses? I wanted a small and compact 28mm lens to use either on my MP or my M11 for everyday use and for travel. The 28mm Summilux f1.4 is a great lens, super sharp and great colors, but I find that it's not that easy to take around everywhere because of the size and the weight. The 28mm Summilux f5.6 is a super small and lightweight, but it's so small that it starts to affect the ergonomics. So it can be difficult to control the aperture and the focus ring just because of how small the size is. And it's limited to f5.6 at the widest aperture, so not that great for low light situations. So theoretically, the Elmarit f2.8 should be a good middle ground between the Summilux and the Summilux. And it's also one of the most inexpensive Leica lenses in their current lineup, almost half the price of the Summicron, which is the next step up. Full disclosure, I previously owned a used copy of an older version of the 28mm Elmarit, but I found that it wasn't that sharp, so I sold it and I went with the Summicron. But I kept hearing that the Elmarit should be a super sharp lens, so I went ahead and purchased the newest version. Normally, I recommend buying Leica M lenses used, but I couldn't find the current version with a recent copy at a used price. So I was excited to see how this new Elmarit would perform in terms of sharpness and compare it directly to the 20mm Summilux f1.4. I'll get into the sample photos and the comparison to the Summilux, but just to finish up the unboxing, it comes with the usual documentation and manual and the very nice leather case. And at the very bottom of the case, underneath the trapdoor, there's a finishing ring and a metal lens cap. The finishing ring is used to protect the threads if you don't want to use the lens hood. And the lens body itself is just as beautiful and well made and well put together as expected. The aperture ring is nice and clicky, but not too loose, and it stays in the position that you set it. And the focus ring is slightly stiff right out of the box, but it loosens up pretty quickly, and it's easy to use. And it does have that focus tab at the bottom. The lens hood cap is made of plastic, so that's the only downside here. I would prefer that be made of metal, but the lens hood itself is a metal hood, and it's a good quality and well put together. It is ventilated on one corner so as not to obstruct the optical viewfinder. But the lens hood does add a significant amount of length to the lens body. So if you take off the lens hood and the back cap, you see actually how small the lens is. And aside from the Summicron, I think this is the smallest lens that Leica currently makes. And that's one of the biggest positives of this lens. It's small and lightweight and compact, so it's very easy to carry around as an everyday lens. It's not only easy to carry around on the camera or in the pocket as an extra lens, it also makes the camera body less obtrusive and less noticeable by most people. And because the length is smaller, it's less likely to get damaged by bumping it on other things. So I'm okay with using this without the lens hood, and I'm just going to use it with the finishing ring and the lens cap. So the size and the weight and the build quality and the look of the lens, these are all just perfect. But the biggest test is how sharp is this lens and what kind of character do these images have. I shot all of these images on the M11 in aperture priority, mostly at f8. And looking at my computer screen, I'm not sure if it shows up on YouTube, but these images came out very sharp. This lens performs very well on the latest Leica 60mm digital sensors, and I have no complaints as far as sharpness, even when I zoom in. The colors and the contrast are very realistic and lifelike, and these images require very little editing. The colors are not oversaturated and they're not too pale, and it's actually close to what you see in real life. This one was shot wide open at f2.8, so you can see that the bokeh is not too pronounced. So it doesn't do a great job with bokeh. My 50mm Summilux or my 75mm Summicron does a much better job with getting a creamy, out of focus background. This Elmarit is not a bokeh lens or a low light lens, but it is a great street photography lens. It's very compact and lightweight and unobtrusive, and it's a great lens to use with zone focusing. I'll compare the size and the build quality first, and then I'll get into the image comparisons. Both the Elmarit and the Summilux have great build quality. The aperture ring and the focus ring, no complaints there, and they work just as they should. Both lenses have a square metal lens hood and the plastic lens hood caps. And that makes sense because they were both released around the same time, I think around 2016 or 2015. So when you compare the size with the lens hoods on, you can see that the Elmarit is obviously smaller, but you really see the difference once you remove the lens hoods. The Elmarit just looks tiny in comparison to the Summilux, and you can also feel it in the weight of these two lenses. And mounting this on the M11, the Elmarit is a great fit for an M body, and it looks right at home on an M body. The lens is small and compact, but actually the lens hood makes it seem much larger than it actually is. So if you remove the lens hood, that's where you see actually how small and compact this lens is. And comparing this with the Summilux, this is actually a large lens and top heavy, and removing the lens hood is not really an option for me because I feel like I need to have that on to protect the front element since this is such an expensive lens. So I just did a quick and dirty comparison between these two lenses on the M11 using the same settings. Stop down to f8. Again, the Elmarit is a nice and sharp lens, very little distortion, and very good colors. And on the Summilux at f8, the sharpness is actually very similar to the Elmarit. I looked in closely in Lightroom, and without looking at the labels, I had a very hard time telling the difference between the Elmarit and the Summilux. In terms of center sharpness, I could not tell any difference between these two lenses, but I could only tell a slight difference when I looked in at the corners. The blades of grass are just slightly sharper on the Summilux compared to the Elmarit. So stop down at f8. These lenses are actually very comparable in terms of sharpness, and you wouldn't know the difference unless you actually cropped in closely. And in terms of color and character, I couldn't really tell the difference here either. The Elmarit has a very lifelike and realistic reproduction. Good contrast and not too punchy and not too flat. And here with the Summilux, again, very similar to the Elmarit in terms of color representation and contrast. People talk about a distinct Sumilex look, but I'm having trouble picking that out here in these images. Maybe it's just the environment that I took these in, but the Sumilex so far is looking very similar to the Elmarit. And these next two I shot at f2.8 using aperture priority and focusing in on the statue. So the background was slightly blurred out. And again, very similar results between these two lenses. And these two, I shot both of these at their widest aperture. The Elmarit at f2.8 just has this slight bokeh effect in the background. But here with the Sumilex, you see that much improved bokeh, much more pleasing blurring out of the background with the Sumilex wide open at f1.4. So I haven't had extensive experience with this lens by any means, but so far in my short use with this lens, I'm pretty satisfied with it so far. The size and the weight, very compact and nice to use. And the sharpness is very good when stopped down to f8. I only noticed that the Sumilex was sharper in the corners when I zoomed in closely, and obviously the Sumilex has better bokeh and a low light capability. But in terms of size and price and performance, I think the Elmarit makes a great street photography lens. But if I didn't already have the Sumilex f1.4, I might have just gone with the Summicron f2.0 instead of both of these lenses. I hear that the Summicron is also a very sharp lens, and it's just slightly larger than the Elmarit. But since I already had the Sumilex, I went with the Elmarit as a lighter weight option to use for street photography and travel. And I'm looking forward to using the Elmarit on my Leica MP film camera since it will be very lightweight and compact. And I really don't need the extra resolving power of the Sumilex on my film camera. So the Elmarit seems like it would be a great choice for either film or digital. But I will have to test this out on my Leica MP and see how the results come out.